The atmosphere in the Los Angeles County Courthouse was stifling, almost oppressive. The gallery was packed with spectators whispering among themselves as they observed the unfolding drama. At the defendant's table stood Jalen Dawson, a 19-year-old whose confident posture belied his youth. Despite the serious charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't intimidated by the proceedings. Judge Walter Grayson peered down at Jalen over his glasses, his expression revealing a mixture of condescension and amusement. The judge's fingers tapped leisurely against the polished wood of his bench as he addressed the young man standing before him. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Judge Grayson remarked with dry humor. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Scattered laughter rippled through the courtroom. The court officers, the stenographer, even the prosecutor seemed to share in the judge's derision, but Jalen remained stoic, unfazed by their mockery. Behind his composed exterior lay years of preparation, not for this specific predicament, but for understanding the legal system itself. While his peers had devoted their time to sports statistics and video games, Jalen had immersed himself in case law and legal procedures. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 2 decades, and Jalen had grown up absorbing the stories she brought home, tales of prosecutorial shortcuts, judicial favoritism, and defense attorneys who barely put forth effort. By 14, he could analyze a trial more effectively than many law students. Yet none of this impressed Judge Grayson, who saw him as just another troublemaker passing through his courtroom. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, opening the case file with visible indifference. "I have a golf game at 2. More laughter followed, but this time, something shifted. A subtle smile crossed Jalen's lips. Judge Grayson had just made his first misstep, though no one had noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the self-assured manner of someone who considered the case already won. His tailored suit, perfect tie, and rehearsed delivery spoke of countless similar presentations. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond any doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6 reported missing hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The statement landed heavily in the courtroom, causing murmurs among the spectators. On the surface, it seemed damning: a stolen car, a chase, an attempt to escape. The judge glanced briefly at Jalen before turning back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor approached the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned to lock eyes with Jalen. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension intensified as Carrington continued. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was conducted properly." Judge Grayson nodded in agreement. "Sounds straightforward to me." To most in attendance, the case indeed seemed clear-cut. However, Jalen had spent too much time studying trials not to perceive the flaws in the prosecution's narrative. Still, he remained silent, observing and waiting for the right moment. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since entering the courtroom. She stood nervously. "Your Honor, my client—" Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A quiet request. She hesitated before returning to her seat. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," Jalen announced, his voice calm and steady. Complete silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Grayson stared at him with unconcealed amusement. "You'll what?" "I'll be defending myself," Jalen repeated, his composure unwavering. Murmurs spread through the gallery. The bailiff raised his eyebrows in surprise. Carrington let out a sharp laugh. "This should be interesting." But the laughter ceased when Jalen took his first step forward. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly as he positioned himself, hands still in his pockets, and allowed the silence to linger just long enough to create a sense of anticipation. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "Go ahead." "You stated Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington replied with evident boredom. "That's right, and that testimony is documented in his report." "Of course it is," Jalen nodded, then turned to address Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The judge narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" Jalen removed his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A look of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report claims he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should correspond with his location history. Jalen paused meaningfully. But I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Grayson frowned and glanced toward Carrington. Counselor? Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by a law enforcement officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen gave a casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will confirm it, but if he wasn't? The judge studied him for a long moment before turning to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated, and that pause spoke volumes. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years observing trials, studying prosecutors and their methods, the way they manipulated the system, and he knew with certainty that if Carrington truly believed in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor? Carrington finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the dynamic had already begun to shift. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing. There was silence, but the tension was palpable. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence beginning to crack. Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle, Carrington stated. Jalen nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. That's true. He took a step forward. But let's examine that evidence for a moment, shall we? Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue. Turning to the jury, Jalen made eye contact with each member. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the narrative they're presenting, but let's approach this logically. He took a deep breath, maintaining his calm, controlled tone. Imagine you enter a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, perhaps zip it up, then return it to the rack and leave. Hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the presence of your fingerprints on it mean you were the thief? Several jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery whispered something inaudible. The car in question was parked outside a convenience store hours before the alleged theft, Jalen continued. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we passed the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was unlocked, a moment of idle curiosity. I didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from it. He let his words sink in before asking incisively, does touching something automatically make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, frantically searching through his notes for something to regain control of the narrative. But Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're discussing the fingerprint analysis, let's talk about how that examination was conducted. He turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? The judge blinked, caught off guard by the question, and glanced at Carrington, who reluctantly admitted, no. Jalen's lips tightened. So, the state is using forensic evidence to try to convict me, but they didn't consider it necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No opportunity for me to cross-examine, inquire about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis? Carrington's jaw clenched as Jalen nodded, as if receiving confirmation of what he already suspected. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, the look of a man realizing this case wasn't the straightforward win he had anticipated, but Jalen had more to reveal. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never included in the prosecution's filings, and I believe I know why. He turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for his response. Instead, he retrieved a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held up the paper. This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it, yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling to recover. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. No, I wasn't, Jalen countered, his voice not rising in volume, but cutting through the courtroom with precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't fleeing from anything. The only connection tying me to this case is poor police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, massaging his temple. The case was unraveling rapidly, and everyone present could sense it. Jalen turned back to address the jury. The real perpetrator escaped that night. The officers found a young black man in the general vicinity and decided that was sufficient. That's what this case is truly about. Silence descended on the courtroom. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He looked at Jalen for a considerable time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and pronounced the words that would resonate with everyone present. Case dismissed. A moment of stunned silence followed, then chaos erupted. Half the courtroom exploded in reactions, some expressing disbelief, others quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters frantically writing in their notebooks. Jalen remained still, allowing the reality to register with everyone. Judge Grayson, still holding his gavel, regarded Jalen with an expression that hadn't been there before. Recognition, perhaps even regret. Jalen met his gaze before turning to leave. As he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen paused but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, You should consider law school. Jalen smiled slightly. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on that path. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended toward him. Jalen! Did you anticipate the judge would dismiss the case? What are your plans now? How does it feel to outmaneuver an experienced prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. This wasn't about demonstrating his intelligence. It was about something far more significant. His mother, Denise, waited for him at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then she shook her head and sighed. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She studied him a moment longer before pulling him into a tight embrace. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras continued flashing, but Jalen no longer paid them any attention. Across the street, Judge Grayson watched from beside his car. His posture had changed. The arrogance had vanished. His expression was no longer one of amusement, but rather of contemplation. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine, just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew this one would stay with him. Because Jalen had accomplished something few ever could, he made the system examine itself. And for once, it blinked first. The lesson here is profound. How many similar cases had proceeded in this manner? How many individuals had been convicted? Not because of evidence, but due to bias, shortcuts, and a system more concerned with closing cases than discovering truth? Jalen possessed the knowledge to defend himself. But what about those who don't? This wasn't about a single case, it was about all of them. He understood what his next steps would be. This courtroom wouldn't be the last he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He would be the attorney, and when that day arrived, he wouldn't be alone. If this narrative made you pause and reflect, even briefly, then share it with others. The justice system is founded on laws, but it's operated by people, and people can change, but only if we compel them to do so. The world needs more voices in the dark, illuminating the shadows where injustice thrives. Join us in this mission by subscribing. A channel dedicated to telling the stories that matter, championing truth, and amplifying narratives that challenge the status quo. Because in a world of systemic inequality, your voice, your action, and your awareness create the light needed for change. Subscribe today and become part of a community that refuses to let injustice hide in silence.